All right, if you're just joining us, we are going to start the webinar in just a moment. People are filing in. If you are here for the webinar, calling the thing by its proper name, you are in the right place. If you are not here for that webinar, there's still time to get off this plane. We'll be starting in just a couple of minutes. Just bear with us. Thank everyone who is joining us now. We had a very large number of RSVPs, so we're going to give just a few extra moments for people to file into the Zoom room before we start the actual webinar. And also welcome to everyone who is watching this on Facebook. We are now streaming live on Facebook as well. All right, we're going to get started in just about 30 seconds. There's still people streaming into the room. All right, I think we're going to get started. Good afternoon and welcome everybody. I'm Lara Friedman. I'm the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, and welcome to our webinar today, Calling the Thing by Its Proper Name, Apartheid Between the River and the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. So as some background, it's long been debated whether the term apartheid has a place in a discussion of Israel's rule over Palestinians on one side of the Green Line or on both sides of the Green Line. While many Palestinian analysts and activists have for decades used Black South African struggles against apartheid as a legal and moral touchstone in their challenges to Israeli policies, defenders of Israel have long rejected this framing as inaccurate and irrelevant to the Israeli context, attacking those using the term apartheid, even those who are using it with respect only to the situation in the occupied territories, as anti-Israel and even anti-Semitic. Is it time to recognize Israel on both sides of the Green Line as an apartheid state today? With the occupation and the separate and unequal regimes it involves now in its 54th year, and with the 28-year peace process paradigm and its two-state solution rendered largely obsolete by Israeli facts on the ground, and those are facts that were established expressly for that purpose, and with the nation-state law codifying discrimination against Palestinians as a constitutional principle of the state of Israel, and these are Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel, the question has salience today, both with respect to injecting honesty into the discussion around Israel-Palestine and to injecting energy, focus, and I would say urgency into the fight for justice, human rights, freedom, and peace. So that's the background. So to discuss these questions, the Foundation is proud to host this conversation with a panel of experts, whom I will now introduce in alphabetical order. We start with Haggai Elad. Haggai is the executive director of Israel's premier human rights organization, B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territories, which recently published a groundbreaking paper entitled, quote, "A Regime of Jewish Supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. This is Apartheid." Previously, Haggai was director of the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, ACRI, and the Jerusalem Open House for Pride and Tolerance, and he lives in Jerusalem. Second, we have Nathan Thrall. Nathan is the author of The Only Language They Understand, Forcing Compromise in Israel and Palestine, which I recommend very highly. He also recently published an essay entitled The Separate Regime's Delusion, and Nathan lives in Jerusalem. And then we have Sausan Zaher. Sausan is a Palestinian feminist and human rights lawyer based in Haifa, who is Deputy General Director and Senior Litigator at Adalah, the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Israel. Sausan has litigated several landmark cases before the Israeli Supreme Court, challenging discriminatory laws and policies against Palestinians, including the recent passed Jewish nation-state basic law. So you can read their full bios on our website, and my colleagues, I think, are putting links to their Twitter handles and their websites and their key articles into the chat box as we speak. So some housekeeping before we begin. As is FMEP's regular practice, the format for today's webinar is going to be a discussion between the panelists and me. In addition to my questions, and I have many, we are eager to take your questions from the audience, which can be submitted via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. So feel free to submit questions at any time throughout the panel. I'll be keeping an eye on the Q&A box, and I'll do my best to factor the questions in as best I can. And if you're seeing the raise hand option, which I am on my Zoom window for some reason, ignore it. We're not going to be calling on people. So if you raise your hand, we're just not calling on people. That's not how this goes. Also, please note, as I said, the webinar is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. A video will be available on both Facebook and FMEP website at www.fmep.org after the event. If you think it was good, share it with your friends, family, colleagues, everyone. Finally, if you have technical problems with the webinar, let us know using the chat function, which is also at the bottom of your Zoom window. Don't use the chat function for questions. I say this every time, I mean it. I'm not checking the chat box. So if you put the questions in there, I won't see them, so I won't be asking them. And as we go through the panel, keep an eye on the chat box yourself, because my wonderful colleagues, Kristen and Sarah Ann, will be throwing up resources into the box to articles and other things that the speakers may mention. If you miss something, all of those resources that will be thrown up during the webinar will also be posted on our website with the video. So if you miss it now, you can catch it later. So housekeeping done, let's get into it. I want to start with you, Haggai. I want to start off by quoting the recent B'Tselem report, which stated, and I'm quoting, "The entire area between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River is organized under a single principle, advancing and cementing the supremacy of one group, Jews, over another, Palestinians." It then goes on, "There is one regime governing the entire area and the people living in it based on a single organizing principle." That's why I'm doing ellipses. "The term we have used in recent years to describe the situation, such as prolonged occupation or a one-state reality, are no longer adequate." You go on to say, "To continue effectively fighting human rights violations, it is essential to examine and define the regime that governs the entire area." So, for more than 30 years, B'Tselem has focused only on the situation in the occupied territories. It's actually in the name of your organization. So now you've shifted to looking at the whole of the area, inside the Green Line and the occupied territories. Can you unpack for us what you mean with this river to the sea analysis? And can you talk about what you mean when you say supremacy of Jews over Palestinians, and why this is the framework within which you are addressing the issues today?
Thank you, Lara, both for the question and more broadly for the opportunity to be on this webinar this evening. I have to say I'm very excited about today's conversation. I very much look forward to listening to both Nathan and Sausan, and hopefully also questions from the audience. As you've read from the opening of the report, but also mentioning the legacy of the organization, like 30 years of work, I would want to believe, and that other people believe as well, that over these more than 3 decades that B'Tselem has developed an intimate relationship with facts. We think that they matter. Reality has changed over the years. We are not where things were decades ago. And also our thinking has evolved internally over the years. And because of that, and through that, we came to the conclusion that there's a need to try and look at the entire area that Israel controls in order to make an analysis that would be more intimately related to reality, more intimately related to the facts. So that's what we have done. And we have found it sufficiently compelling to share it with the world. So that's what we've done. If I unpack it, what are the essential ingredients of what we are saying? And I'm running through this very quickly. So one essential aspect, of course, is there's one regime, one government that controls everyone and everything between the river and the sea. We live in a reality of demographic parity, 14 million people between the river and the sea, half of them Jews approximately, half of them Palestinians. But reality is set up in a fashion that demographic parity doesn't translate into parity in power or resources, right? And we examine the way that plays out, not in all relevant aspects, but only in 4 key aspects: land management, immigration, demographics, freedom of movement, and political power. And we analyze in, I think, great detail and nuance the way this works out for Jews in the entire territory Israel controls. Well, you will see that Jews receive the same first-class package everywhere. And we analyze that situation for Palestinians, and you see that there are differences between the situation inside Israel proper, or in East Jerusalem, or in the rest of the West Bank, or in Gaza. And there are differences, and they're meaningful. However, in each and every one of these subunits, Palestinians get a partial package of less rights. As a result of that, there's not a single square inch between the river and the sea in which a Jew and a Palestinian would be equal. So what we see is that with the differences factored in, the same principle is at play everywhere between the river and the sea. A regime that is working to engineer reality so that Jews will enjoy all these benefits and privileges and Palestinians will not. Now, so that's the correct analysis. We just think that we haven't done anything, besides describing reality as it is in this. What I want to conclude with is to point out the dangers of what you end up with if you follow a different reality, a reality untethered to reality. And then I fear you end up with two big lies. One is a worldview that analyzes the situation not as I've described, not as B'Tselem points out, but a model, an outdated, untethered to reality model of democracy plus occupation. Democracy inside the Green Line and a temporary occupation project on the other side of the Green Line. No, that's not the way things are. And we need to wake up and move forward from that misconception to what it is, apartheid. The other big lie is this continuation of describing the context of the reality here vis-a-vis Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. When in fact, what we have here is a state that is neither Jewish nor democratic. It is not Jewish because, as I said in the beginning, we have demographic parity between the river and the sea. It's a binational reality. This is not a moral judgment. I'm just describing things as they are. And it's not democratic because A, there are millions of Palestinians that live under the rule of this regime that never get to vote and are not part of the political process, and because self-evidently and obviously no apartheid regime is by definition democratic.
Thanks. I think that's a wonderful way to start off. Very clear. I want to move to Sausan, and really picking up where Haggai left off. Critics of this whole framing of using the word apartheid, of talking about both sides of the Green Line as a single entity, critics often point to Palestinian citizens of Israel as the proof that this is not a valid framing. And the argument basically goes that Palestinian citizens of Israel, they are full citizens, they vote, they can be judges, they can be ambassadors, and that proves that this isn't apartheid, period. What do you think of that? And if it's not apartheid, what would you call it? And how do you see the efforts to distinguish between Israeli rule inside the Green Line versus Israeli rule inside the occupied territories?
Okay, so good evening, everyone, and thanks for the invitation and thanks for joining. I'm also happy to be here for this interesting and challenging discussion. The statement or the things that you put, Lara, are not new for us. They have been taking another form before when everyone was telling us, what do you want? It's not racism because Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. And then we also had to respond by the fact that it should be, but X, Y, Z, bringing all the facts. Now, the issue here is that, yes, there are a little bit of, we are talking about two legal systems that are in the OPT and in the OPTs and in Israel. However, if we look at it, we are talking about, we can define it as one regime, saying that it's one regime. The definition or the description is another question. But we can also say that there indeed might be differences, and I want to as well, point out the differences, because when you talk about apartheid, the first things that come into your mind is apartheid South Africa. And we need here to distinguish and say that indeed there might be some differences between apartheid South Africa and what's happening and apartheid inside the Green Line in terms like in regard with the Palestinian citizens of Israel. Because first of all, you know, put aside appointing judges and so on. First of all, the claim is that Palestinians vote and can be elected to the Knesset, and that's a fact from the first election in 1949. And this is the main difference between what's going on in Israel in regards to the Palestinian citizen and what was going on in apartheid South Africa. This could have changed everything. However, our argument and our view and perspective and analysis from the work that we have been doing for more than 25 years in Adala, and also people before us have been doing that, is that even if Palestinian citizens in Israel do have the constitutional right to vote and get elected to the parliament, and they do fulfill it, it is in a political and legal framework that puts domination and ethnic and national supremacy within the framework of being elected and voting. Why? Because Article 7A of the Basic Law Knesset, which has a constitutional status, prevents or prohibits on any person, individual or party from being elected if they revoke or if they are against the definition of Israel as a democratic and Jewish state. This says a lot. This means that you must do your parliamentary activity within the Jewish state, within the Jewish supremacy that is being anchored in the laws. And if you want to call for equality for all citizens, like what Balad or the National Arab Party has been doing since it was established in the late 90s, disqualification motions are automatically being submitted. And this is a fact that we see every election cycle of disqualification. And now we are also expecting it again towards the Knesset election in March. But I also hear, just in order not to take much time, I think that the question is, even if you have judges, even if you have the ability to vote and get elected to the parliament, the real question and the serious question is who dominates, who rules? If in comparison to South Africa, the answer is the whites, who are the people, are the dominating group that ruled, even though if they were minority. In our case, the dominating group and the ruling group that has been able to rule in a coalition, in a government since 1948 until today, has been the Jewish majority, ethnic majority. And this is again within the within norms and principles of ethnic supremacy that, as Haggai mentioned, have been anchored as constitutional principles and values in the latest Jewish nation-state basic law.
Thank you so much. And I want to come back in a little while to dig a little bit deeper into some of the stuff you've raised. Going over to Nathan now. So Nathan, in your recent analysis, which I should just say, the timing of this with the B'Tselem piece is coincidental. These things, there's obviously, this is in the zeitgeist right now, right? In the recent analysis you wrote, and I'm going to quote, "The premise that Israel is a democracy, and it says, rests on the belief that one can separate the pre-1967 state from the rest of the territory under its control. A conceptual wall must be maintained between two regimes, good democratic Israel and its bad provisional occupation." You argue that this is basically a delusion and that it derives from, quote, political rather than legal considerations. Can you talk about what you mean by it being a delusion? And I mean, some of this is what Haggai has already talked about, but go into a little more. And also why you think the political rather than legal considerations are what drive this. What are those considerations and who carries them?
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me, Lara, and I'm very glad to be here with you Sausan and Hagai and Lara, all of you. So I don't want to spend too much time regurgitating what's in the article, but I will just say that briefly, part of what I'm critiquing is a very widespread view that undergirds the entire Middle East peace process and all of the rhetoric of the diplomatic community and the press. And that worldview is basically that there is a democratic Israel within the Green Line, or according to some, within the Green Line plus annexed East Jerusalem. And then there's a temporary occupation next to it. And that temporary occupation is not part of the state of Israel. It's somewhere outside the state of Israel. It's a separate regime. And it may be horrible what's happening inside the occupied territory, but we needn't concern ourselves with it too much because it's happening somewhere outside over there. And in addition, it's going to be resolved when this temporary state of affairs comes to an end. And so everybody was very worried recently about de jure annexation. And when that didn't take place, many on the left celebrated and said, we won. We won, de jure annexation didn't happen. But all of the oppressive policies that we should be concerned about have continued. And on US election day, an entire Palestinian village was demolished and dozens of people were made homeless. And you could say, well, it's a temporary occupation, and when they have statehood, they'll be able to return to their homes, and so we needn't worry too much. So a big part of what I was doing in the piece was to really examine this notion that Israel in its pre-1967 borders is separate from a different regime in the occupied territories. And I give a number of different examples of how the settlements are integrally connected to the state of Israel, how major highways connect Israel to the settlements, how 1 in 10 Israeli Jews live beyond the Green Line, how these are people who are in every workplace, in extended families. They are Supreme Court justices, they're ministers, they're legislators. This is the national project of the state of Israel. And it's not some separate temporary state of affairs that's external to the state. And I also describe how the institutions of the state operate on both sides of the Green Line, how the National Park Service has parks on both sides of the Green Line, which Israelis from Tel Aviv go to Herodian, and they go to Sebastia, and Israelis travel on major highways to go to the Dead Sea. They're going through the West Bank. The only way to leave Jerusalem to get to the Ben Gurion airport is to travel on highways that go through the West Bank, both of them. What I try and demonstrate in the piece is that the Israeli settlements are integrally connected to the state of Israel. The settlements have municipal buildings, they have courthouses, they have the national HMOs for Israel, they have schools, they have benefits. When you go to the Nefesh B'Nefesh website and you look, where can I move to when I make Aliyah and immigrate to Israel? They advertise Ma'ale Adumim and many of the settlements. They have major shopping malls, and Israelis inside Green Line Israel go and they shop there. Many of the people in my neighborhood in Jerusalem have been priced out of this neighborhood and they live in the settlements, and it's seamless for them. There's no difference. They move there, it's just a suburb. It's no different from Green Line Israel. What I try and do in the piece as well is to show that it's not just for Israeli Jews that that there's one regime that's ruling over them, but it's also for Palestinians. And I describe how for millions of Palestinians in the West Bank who live in Area A and B, which are the islands designated in Oslo. There are 165 of them. They're disconnected. They sit in a sea of Israeli control, which is called Area C, and that's 62% of the West Bank. And if we take a macro view and we abandon this rhetoric of a green line democratic Israel, a temporary occupation, and more or less a Palestinian state in the making next to this democratic state of Israel with whom it does have a border dispute that will be resolved in Palestinian statehood. If we abandon that and just look objectively at the situation on the ground, what we see between the river and the sea is Israeli total control, one sovereign, and even Israeli administration, direct administration over 90% of the territory. So 78% is what Israel acquired in the 48 war. The remaining 22% is the part that is annexed, East Jerusalem and 28 surrounding villages, which is a small fraction of the remaining 22%, Gaza, which is less than 1% of the territory, and the West Bank. And within the West Bank, Israel directly controls and administers all of Area C, 62% of the West Bank. You put all of that together, it's 90% direct Israeli administration and control without any kind of Palestinian authority, autonomy, presence. And even within those 165 islands that make up less than 10% of the territory that the majority of the West Bank Palestinian population lives in, even there, Israel goes in there at will. It goes in there every night, breaks into homes, no warrants, arrests people, and it even, according to Oslo, has the right to enter for non-security reasons, to enter to arrest car thieves. And once a Palestinian is arrested in the middle of Ramallah by Israel, often who are they arrested by? They're not arrested by a separate military regime. Often they're arrested by units of the Israeli National Police, Yamam, Yamas, and then they are taken across the Green Line for interrogation inside West Jerusalem in an interrogation facility. And then they cross back over to a military trial at the Ofer Military Detention Center. And then they appeal the case at the Israeli High Court of Justice, which is the High Court of Justice, the last court of appeal for everyone from the river to the sea. So a lot of the piece is trying to establish through facts how there is one regime that's controlling all the territory. Now, to answer your second part, and I fear I'm going on way too long here, the second part of your question is, what do you mean by political rather than legal? And what I mean is that there is a false belief that our description of reality dictates the political outcome. So if I say there's a one-state reality, it means I must necessarily support a one-state solution. There can only be a one-state solution if it's a one-state reality. That's a totally false belief. If Israel annexes formally all the territory, Gaza and the West Bank, tomorrow, you can still divide, partition, however you like. There's nothing to prevent you from doing that. And the belief exists on both sides. So proponents of two states also believe that by clinging to the notion that there are these two separate entities, that it's more likely that it will manifest itself in a two-state outcome that they prefer. And I think that we need to stop masking reality because of our preferred political preference. So that's what I mean by political rather than legal.
Great. All right. So I want to stick with you for a second, and there's a lot I want to drill down into that. Specifically, there's something that I found striking in your piece, and within the progressive community, there's long been mention of the word apartheid, usually in terms of a threat, right? If we don't do this, it's going to look more like apartheid. We're 5 minutes to midnight, and the two-state solution is dead, and then it'll be apartheid. In your piece, you basically argue that the reality has been apartheid for 72 years. that except for this brief period, there were 6 months between 66 and 67, when Israel had ended its military government that ruled over Palestinian citizens of Israel, and before it started the occupation, that except for those 6 months, it's always effectively been apartheid, which frankly has been the answer I've given for years when people have said to me, can Israel be Jewish and democratic? My answer has been, nobody knows. It's never been tried except for that 6 months. But that does beg the question, what is different now? I mean, for folks who are coming to this conversation thinking, okay, well, it's the nation state law and it's annexation, therefore we have to talk about this. Why is it important to make clear that this has actually been an ongoing process of apartheid, and it's more, this is choosing your timing to say it as opposed to choosing your time to say when it happened?
So I agree with everything that you said. It has been the case that with the exception of the 6 months from the end of the military government in December 1966 until the beginning of the West Bank occupation in June 1967, for all of the remaining 99-point-something% of Israel's history, the majority of the Palestinians under Israel's control were subjected to harsh military rule. That had been said prior to my piece, and it should be said, and it's been said by many others. What I think is important about the present moment is that we have a return of Biden to power, and the return of the Democrats to power, and we have a whole peace process industry that's welcoming this return and is eager to begin the whitewash of apartheid again, to begin to say, let's bring the parties to the table, to begin to say, it's a temporary occupation, it will be resolved, to begin to talk about Palestinian state building, to begin to talk about confidence building measures and alleviating things on the ground, and to invest in all MEP projects to Palestinian women and Israeli Jewish women baking cookies for peace. And all of this activity, it is actually obfuscating. It's whitewashing a continued oppression that with no end in sight. And I think it's very important to describe the length that this has gone on and to appreciate how long it's going to continue, and that it's inexcusable to justify our present policies with a fiction that it's about to end.
Thanks, and that really comes back to the title, calling it by its proper name is perhaps the beginning of dealing with what it really is. Hagai, I want to follow up on that with you. One of the criticisms I've seen of the new B'Tselem report, which I highly recommend folks read, setting aside whether people agree or disagree with the framing, is that the embrace that it has of the apartheid paradigm as a basis for understanding the current situation, it doesn't actually offer or suggest any tangible new ideas for how to resolve the conflict. Now, I do not believe that analysis is invalid if you don't answer other people's questions. I mean, the analysis stands on its own, but presumably you would argue that by calling the thing by its proper name, that is a first step to finding a solution. But beyond that, how would you respond to this criticism?
Thank you. I want to answer this, but also to connect to what Nathan was saying, and also to your analogy, which is one of my favorites, of like how many minutes exactly are we before midnight? I think there's an ongoing argument whether it's 2 minutes to midnight or 5 minutes to midnight, but apparently the clock has been in that range for the last, I can't even count how many years, right? And I can't stress this enough. This is not just an academic exercise that B'Tselem is involved in because we want to shift from one frame to another and we think this is interesting. No, these are the facts. And if anyone wants to argue with us, then let's argue on the merits and let's see what other compelling analysis of the situation can be presented. But, and here I get to what Nathan was saying, the alternative of holding on to an analysis that is untethered to reality isn't just factually wrong, it is morally bankrupt. Because with that, people are pushing consequences into a future that never arrives. Because it's always 2 minutes to midnight, so we don't need to wake up to reality, so we can continue cultivating the industry that Nathan mentioned and the realities that we're all familiar with, so that we will always avoid the one thing that would actually make a difference, which is consequences, right? Because the ability of Israel to arrive at this situation in 2021 is not, it stands on two legs. One leg is advancing the project gradually at the expense of the rights of Palestinians, but the other leg is impunity. Impunity is what is delivered to us by the international community. And there are endless excuses as to why we don't need to arrive at that, because there will be negotiations, because it's still not midnight, because in all of the other lies. So we hope that A, facts will matter, and B, if international stakeholders and people domestically that care about justice will wake up to reality, then it will inform their conclusions as to what needs to be done and when does it need to happen, right? Now, we have been saying already for quite some time, and that is not new. That did not wait for this recent position paper, that the way we see it, the way we analyze the situation, the only nonviolent path to change the situation here is through international action. And it is incumbent on international actors to heed to that call and to stand up to what they should be committed to. And the last thing I will say in that regard, because we are having this conversation this evening, one day after the inauguration of a new president in the US, that the call to align American foreign policy with values, with protections of human rights globally, is something that we hear more and more strongly in recent years. I am very encouraged by that. Obviously, no one thought that that's going to be implemented in any shape or form during the Trump years, but now there's a different administration. And that's an open question, whether that administration will just jump back into where we were 4 years ago, into after 8 years of additional American underwriting of successful Israeli oppression of Palestinians with no consequences, or are we at the beginning of a new chapter?
Thank you. Sausan, coming back to you, I want to talk a little bit about the nation state law. And the nation state law came as something of a shock to, I think, a lot of supporters of Israel, certainly the United States, exactly because of what Nathan was talking about earlier, which is this line that they draw between what's happening inside the Green Line and in the occupied territories, because this is a law which effectively codifies a different status for Palestinian citizens of Israel. It codifies a Jewish supremacy, or I think Adallah says it enshrines Jewish supremacy over Palestinian citizens. Adallah has said it has distinct apartheid characteristics, which I think is undeniable. And you go on. I would like you to talk to us about the importance of the nation state law in understanding what kind of regime Israel is on both sides of the Green Line. And for yourself, I'd be interested in how the nation state law, if it changed your own understanding, your own analysis of the Israeli regime, or if this was just sort of a logical expression of where it already was.
Yeah, that's a big question. It did not change, the Jewish nation state law did not change our perspective about the Israel regime, because what we have been viewing since 1948 until today, also with massive discriminatory laws since the beginning of the 2000 onwards, which we have challenged most of them in Adallah, just proves that we have been, and this is what we have been arguing and saying all the time, is that we are talking about an institutionalized, racial, segregated, in some terms, of course, institutionalized discriminatory regime towards the Palestinian citizens of Israel, in addition to the occupation that is in the occupied Palestinian territories. Now, what the Jewish nation state law did is that it moved the status of the situation from legislation, policies, regulation into a constitutional status. And I think that the most important article in the Jewish nation state law, which can exist alone without all the rest of the other articles in the basic law, is Article 1. Article 1 comes, and first of all, it should have, because we're talking, just to clarify, the Jewish nation state law is the semi-preamble of a constitution, which basically sets forth the constitutional identity of the state. This is the function and goal of having a preamble. This is the function, this is the purpose of having the Jewish nation state law. So the first article is the most important thing. It should have set the borders of the state. It should have set the definition of who we, the people, in order to know who are the people that are included in this definition and that are entitled for constitutional protection. Instead of doing that, Article 1 of the Basic Law did not define what the borders of the State of Israel are. It did say that Eretz Israel, the land, the historic biblical definition of what Israel is called, the land of Israel, within it, which we know that it is from the river to the sea, within it, the State of Israel was established, and within it, it's regarded, the State of Israel is regarded as the home of the Jewish people, which have the exclusive right for self-determination on a national level, but they also enjoy self-determination on different other levels. Now, this basically sets the basis for apartheid characteristics of the regime, as well as putting discrimination as a constitutional, and segregation as a constitutional value and principle. And therefore, it basically, what we have been challenging all the time in a lot of petitions, challenging discriminatory laws and the state coming and trying to defend it, now we are basically talking about a regime that, because of this basic law, discrimination is a constitutional value and equality is being set back on the side. The fact that self-determination is exclusive for the Jewish people says a lot, because first of all, we're talking about, because of this Article 1, we're talking about a constitutional that applies on Palestinian citizens inside of Israel, and thus enforces a constitutional identity based on Jewish supremacy upon them, but at the same time, it does the same towards Palestinians that are living in the occupied territories, first of all in East Jerusalem and then in the West Bank, because we're talking about all Eretz Israel and the borders are not clear yet. So the applicability of the constitutional identity is not yet known, and it can vary from time to time based on how much the annexation formally or informally is happening as well in the West Bank. So we all know that there is no other constitution in any other democratic country today that has such that set the constitutional identity based on ethnic supremacy of the majority group, and this is something dangerous because it reinforces domination as a constitutional value. And when domination is there, then basically all the constitutional rights, as well as the basic rights that are not that you cannot basically harm or violate, also on international law, like equality and dignity on an individual level and on a group level, are basically threatened because of Article 1.
Thank you, and I actually want to go into that a little bit. So just getting beyond the nation state law itself to the broader set of laws, regulations, practices that shape and structure the lives of Palestinian citizens of Israel. Can you talk about those a little bit? Adala has done a lot of work on discriminatory laws for years, long before the nation state law. Based on those, does the apartheid label resonate with those? I'm thinking coming to mind legislation that, for instance, bars Palestinian citizens of Israel from bringing in spouses who are residents of the West Bank, where I could move to Israel tomorrow. And the other, I think the broader question, if we do apply this apartheid understanding, whether you use the word or not, but this framing, does it require a different solution than using the occupation framing? Adala has always operated as, you are representing Palestinian citizens of Israel first and foremost, which is solutions on that side of the green line. But is the solution now required that applies to both sides of the green line, and what does that look like? And particularly this brings in for me the question of the Nakba, which I will say, as someone who worked on this issue for years within the Jewish community, we sort of felt like we were absolved of having to deal with 48, right? We were going to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict based on 67. That's been alluded to by Nathan and Haggai as well. And the argument seems to be now that maybe that was never possible. Maybe we were deluding ourselves, but certainly based on facts on the ground, there's no way not to have a conversation and a resolution that addresses the Nakba as well.
Yeah, I would like to just make it clear that describing the regime as apartheid, which B'Tselem has done courageously, is very important, and we do agree with it in terms of describing the regime. And it's very important on a political level, more even than on a legal level, because on a legal level, it's a little bit different because there's no definition of a regime of apartheid in international law. There is a crime of apartheid, but not a regime of apartheid. But the question from our point of view is not whether we can say it's apartheid or not, because I can come as you started, there's segregation, like there is apartheid in family unification, where Palestinians are not allowed to enter Israel and live under one roof with their spouses and children and parents, and it's affecting tens of thousands of Palestinians each day. I am not allowed to fall in love with a person from Ramallah or Gaza or any other Arab country and live with him under one roof in Haifa in my house because he is a Palestinian and I'm a Palestinian. We see this as well in the policy of property. The absentee property law is still valid and it's still applicable and until today also inside of Israel. We see the policy toward the Bedouin villages in the south part of Israel, where you have 35 Bedouin villages with more than 100,000 Bedouins who are citizens who live in villages that the state refuses to recognize and thus are not entitled for electricity and water and full education services and health and so on and so on. And we're talking as well as villages that Palestinians until today are not allowed to go back and live in them, like Ikret, the village Ikret and Biraim in the north. So having it apartheid is not the question. The question is what will happen after we call it apartheid? Because what is the remedy? If we demand to end apartheid, does it mean that we are demanding full equality? And if we're demanding full equality, what does it mean for the Palestinians living in the West Bank? Will they be equal vis-a-vis the settlers? Will the settlement remain? And then what will happen with Palestinian? What does it mean having equality? What would it mean with all the things that are the translation of occupation? Does it mean that the army will withdraw from the the West Bank? Does it mean that the Palestinians will have Israeli citizenship, or the settlers? Like, what does this mean? And this is a very crucial question, because it leaves on the side the issue of occupation. And I think that the apartheid narrative and the occupation, ending the occupation narrative, can live together side by side, because the situation is a lot more complicated than saying, okay, yalla, it's apartheid and that's it. Apartheid can be, by the way, a lot more easier, even if it doesn't sound like that, regarding the Palestinians inside of Israel, because you have all the discriminatory laws, and you have the Jewish nation state law, and it's even the Jewish nation state law made us a favor on the international advocacy level, because before we had to argue and convince. Now it made it a lot easier for us. So the remedy and what happens afterward is the most important thing. Therefore, I think that from our point of view, we have been thinking about whether we need to define the regime, or whether we need to adopt discourse of rights. Should it be the discourse of self-determination for all? Should it be the discourse of, should it be the discourse of self-determination for two people? And what does that mean for Palestinians in the West Bank? And what does that mean for Palestinians inside of Israel? I'll continue later.
Thank you. That's great. Nathan, I want to take it to you in a related note. I was thinking about the framing we talked about earlier with the idea that sort of the liberal Zionist side needed to maintain this idea of two separate regimes because you have to believe in two states and all of that. And you can criticize, if you read the article, it's very clear on this. So you focus on criticizing what's happening in the West Bank, and you say, yes, but Israel is Jewish and democratic. I'm curious what you think of the flip side of that. And I'm reflecting on my own, things I've learned as I've gotten older. I mean, for a long time, people would say to me, you people in the peace camp, you don't really want peace, because if you achieve peace, you'll have no jobs. And my answer was always, well, once we end the occupation, then I have to focus on Israel's own internal democracy, which has its own problems, but that can wait. Like, that's on the back burner. I'll deal with this now, as if they were completely separate. And in your article, you talk about how this discrimination is not just national between Israelis and Palestinian non-citizens, but against Jews, against Palestinian subjects and citizens alike. And you actually have an example here from a 2014 report by ACRI about Palestinian citizens of Israel being brought before military courts as if they were West Bankers, which is really just quite striking. Can you talk about this, that sort of flip side of keeping them separate, and to the degree to which this has kept the focus off Israel's own internal democracy deficit, and how that fits into your assessment or your declaration of calling this apartheid now? And you are muted.
Sorry. So I think that, one of the dangers in the discourse about apartheid is that apartheid becomes just another bad word for occupation. So everybody who'd been against occupation until today, I'm pro-Israel, I'm anti-occupation, there's good green line democratic Israel and bad temporary occupation, they can continue with the exact same analysis, the exact same recommendations, this exact same, it's 2 minutes to midnight, the exact same tomorrow it will be apartheid, but never today. And nothing changes. Their policies don't change, even their analysis doesn't change. Absolutely nothing changes. We've just created a new epithet to throw at occupation, rather than changing our actual understanding of the situation. And so I think that it's very important to talk about the fact that there is one government controlling the territory, and it is using different means in different areas, but there is one overall policy of domination. And that domination varies. It's more severe and less severe. And by the way, not just in the West Bank versus the Green Line. There are differences even, first of all, within the West Bank. The subjugation faced by Palestinians in Area C is of a totally different nature than the subjugation faced by Palestinians in Area A and B. Within Jerusalem, within annexed Jerusalem, you know, the nature of the subjugation for Palestinians in many neighborhoods in Jerusalem is much less than it is in neighborhoods of Jerusalem that are cut off by the wall, where they get virtually no services, and the Israeli municipality doesn't enter except to make arrests. And they have to wait sometimes hours in line to cross a checkpoint within their own city to go from one part of their city to the center of it. The nature of the policies varies, the degree of subjugation varies, but it's very important to talk about the overall system. And you know, I think that there's a real temptation to, you know, say, is it, but okay, I accept that, you know, Israel is controlling everything and there's one regime, but is it apartheid alone inside the Green Line, which is an entirely theoretical question. And if we think even about the South African precedent, it makes absolutely no sense. You know, non-whites in South Africa, there were varied means used on different non-white groups against coloreds, against Indians, and you know, the oppression faced by coloreds in Western Cape was very different than the oppression faced by blacks in the Bantustans. And you know, after 1984, South Africa instituted a tricameral parliament. This is in the kind of last decade of apartheid, as an intifada and BDS and ANC terrorism and you know, international opprobrium, all of these things were choking the South African regime, and it made a last-ditch effort to try and give some more rights, and it created what was called a tricameral parliament, and coloreds and Indians who were victims of apartheid were given the right to vote. But they remained victims of apartheid. There were varied means used, and there are varied means used here. And it's very important to be honest about that and to describe the whole situation, and not to play these games of trying to maintain the fiction of two separate regimes, of good Green Line democratic Israel, and by the way, within that good Green Line democratic Israel as well, varied means used. You know, if you live, as Sausan was saying, if you live in an unrecognized village in the Negev, you are basically living with the same kind of repression that Palestinians in Area C face. Your home is being demolished, and you have no electricity and no water and no services. And the state claims that you have actually no right to be there, even in places where you preceded the existence of the state of Israel. So I don't think it makes sense to look at an apartheid regime and start picking up rocks and say, is it apartheid under this rock? Is it apartheid under this rock? There is an apartheid system. And absolutely, let's be honest and look at how it's implemented in varied ways throughout. But let's not play this game of there's apartheid in the West Bank and there's good Green Line democratic Israel, and apartheid will be resolved through the two-state solution that, you know, J Street is going to urge Biden to fulfill in the next 4 years.
And one thing that has been striking to me over the years as I've traveled, particularly like in the Negev, you realize not only as someone, I've worked on West Bank issues for years, not only does what's happening in the Negev feel incredibly familiar, the policies, the tactics, the military, all of it, but the people in the Negev, because it's not considered, it's not occupation, don't enjoy the attention or the support that people who are willing to speak out against the occupation, so that they give to what's happening in the West Bank. And it's sort of, I mean, by saying under this rock it's apartheid, under this rock it's bad, and under this rock it's democracy, it actually has allowed, I think, a lot of people to close their eyes to the very problematic things happening inside Israel, and to what has been, I would argue, the erosion of Israel's democracy over these past 53 odd years, which leads me to my question for Hagai. So Hagai, I have a couple, I'm looking at the Q&A box and I want to weave some ideas into here, but I first want to ask you to talk about the degree to which, as B'Tselem, you've seen occupation policies leach into Israel's national identity and policies inside the Green Line. The idea that I think was articulated, there was a headline today, and I think it was in Haaretz, how the territories annexed Israel versus Israel annexing the territories. And how that fits into this idea that it's apartheid on both sides. And then I also want you to address another critique that I've seen, not so much of the piece, but of the whole discussion around apartheid right now, which is to suggest that while this, okay, it's good that, or if you agree with it, it's good that this framing is now being out there to shed some light on what's actually happening on the ground. It so far, at least as articulated by groups like B'Tselem, it fails to address a core Palestinian contention, which is that securing and promoting Jewish supremacy between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea is a feature, not a bug, of Zionism. It isn't like this just happened by accident and it went off course. This is a feature. And if you're a Palestinian looking at, if you're a Palestinian from, 48, who's now got, relatives living in Lebanon or refugee camps or whatever, this feature has dominated your entire life. So can you talk about how that whole idea of what is Zionism, what is a Zionist project, how it fits into this new discussion around apartheid? So I give you two big questions. Sorry about that.
Thank you. I think I counted like 4 big questions. So I'm going to take the next half hour to answer them, and I apologize in advance. But to use even more time, I just want to continue on like points that were made before. But we're having this conversation this evening, some days after the publication of the B'Tselem report. So we have the benefit of some of the fallout and the conclusions that has played out ever since. And I have to say, like, on the one hand, I'm extremely encouraged. I think that we've managed to make significant headway in terms of engaging on this tethered to reality analysis, and I think that's very significant. And obviously there's much work ahead of us. Having said that, and been already through a number of conversations and briefings and so on, I just want to share that I guess it will never stop amazing me how many times you can give the same presentation, or how many times people can, as if people have read Nathan's piece 50 times over, and yet, as if nothing happened, at the end of that, they will come back to you with the question, but what about the situation inside the Green Line, right? As if like the whole thing about like, one regime and like, no, this is not democracy plus occupation, it's one apartheid, wake up to reality. No, like, but what about the situation inside the Green Line? It is so untethered from the facts. It doesn't provide any pushback. What it does signify, I think, that's my psychological weighing in, is this emotional need to somehow insulate that thing, Israel inside the Green Line, from everything else. And the need to do that is, again, because, I'm saying it's emotional, but that emotional insistence has consequences in terms of perpetuating oppression, subjugation, and apartheid against Palestinians, right? So this is not something that doesn't have consequences, and we need to insist on that, and that's why we are insisting. Now, in terms of the similarities, and the policies moving from one side of the Green Line to the other side of the Green Line, and of course Jerusalem itself being a major laboratory, if you will, of seeing how these processes move from one side to the other side and back and forth in numerous ways. You can see that. I mean, Nathan already mentioned the situation with the barrier inside Jerusalem. You can think about the treatment of Palestinian minors in the Green Line, in East Jerusalem, which is supposed to be like the situation inside the rest of Israel, or on the other side, and so on and so forth. But I wanted to bring up actually something that not directly on that, but I think also like very powerful in the same context, which is the parallel processes of unmasking, right? Because like I think we've already spoken, so I won't go into great detail on like the unmasking that was related to the passage of the Israel as a nation state of the Jewish people basic law, which, as Salson said, what was Israel was doing to Palestinians inside the Green Line didn't wait for that basic law to be enacted. That was the situation since 1948, but it elevated that reality to a constitutional level, and it unmasked a pre-existing reality. And the tangent to that on the other side of the Green Line is, of course, what played out over much of 2020, the discussion of de jure annexation of additional parts of the West Bank beyond East Jerusalem. And again, that was a process of unmasking, right? Because with formal annexation, it's not that Israel would necessarily introduce new policies against Palestinians. There's already de facto annexation. Israel already does whatever it wants, wherever it wants, anywhere in the occupied West Bank. But the conversation about de jure annexation spelled out what I think was self-evident already before that, the Israeli intention to continue controlling the entire territory without giving Palestinian rights, and to somehow salvage the propaganda point of being a democracy out of that. So it's interesting to notice how over the last 2 years, there was these parallel processes of unmasking, of things being spelled out in a clearer way. And that may be, also could be related to the years of the Trump presidency and the tendency of that presidency to say the quiet part out loud, right? And also enable others to act in that fashion. The last thing I want to say, like the other part of the second question that you were asking, we do not pretend to, in 8 pages, to reflect on the history of the last century. That's not what we have done. And we're explicitly saying that our position paper isn't a judgment on the Palestinian national movement or on the Jewish national movement. This is not what we have done. What we want to insist, though, is that people wake up to reality and see it what it is, so that the future will be a different one. And with that, I want to end this answer and say that, like, for us, calling things by their proper name isn't a moment of despair. For us, it's a moment of hope and commitment to the realization of rights, because we do believe that with that, we have a fighting chance.
Terrific, thank you. And I know that my colleague put into the box the article by Lana Tatur, which is exactly about this question of Zionism, and I hope people will read it. It's a really important point. And it brings up my next question for you, Haggai. And I think we have time basically for one more round at the rate we're going. If we have extra time after that, but I think we have time for each of you to have one more solid answer. Haggai, so Palestinians have been calling Israel an apartheid regime and talking about the apartheid practices on both sides of the Green Line for a long time, only to be largely ignored or dismissed out of hand as anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. B'Tselem did it and received a lot of attention and engagement, including from us, favorable and unfavorable, but regardless, it was engaged substantively. Can you talk about this disparity which continues and how the world treats Jews, Israelis or not, versus how they treat Palestinians when it comes to surfacing new ideas, new analysis? Why are some views, the fact that some views are considered more legitimate to engage or debate or listen to? And can you talk to us about how you, as the head of B'Tselem, how you navigate this reality and how this reality can be navigated in a moral and responsible way?
Yeah. First, I have to say I'm addressing this with a lot of humility and frustration, right? Of course, we are well aware of the robust Palestinian position on this issue that has been articulated over the years by scholars and activists and NGOs. And if you look at what I think is a very moving statement that was put out by our colleagues from El-Haq yesterday, they also list in that statement, also the previous examples of this position being taken in in a thoughtful and powerful way by Palestinian colleagues in years past. So I appreciate that, and I think that's very significant.
And we've just put that into the chat box so people can see it.
Excellent, thank you. Having said that, I think it doesn't diminish in any shape or form from the significance of the work that happened in years before to accept how significant it is that in the beginning of 2021, B'Tselem is taking this position because we occupy a space in the domestic and international discourse and analysis and thinking about the situation here. So for us, it's been, I think, a thoughtful, a nuanced and careful and serious internal process, also related to developments of the last 2 years. And also as we enumerate in the position paper itself, obviously the thinking and the position of B'Tselem itself has evolved over the years. And as a response to a changing reality, more facts on the ground accumulating and the clock ticking, and a maturation of the thinking inside the organization. The other thing I just want to say about this, and you touched on it in your question, is also to acknowledge the price that Palestinians have paid and are continuing to pay for taking such positions, right? And accusations of Palestinians that have been calling things by their proper name already for quite some time, either accused of being anti-Semitic or accused of supporting violence and terrorism. So for them, for Palestinian colleagues, I think it took much more courage and risking dire consequences in ways that B'Tselem is still relatively protected compared to that. So I also want to acknowledge that.
And I appreciate that answer very much. This is something that we are really trying to be conscious of at the foundation and trying to center and elevate Palestinian voices with the knowledge that they are far too often, for too long, have not been at the center of this conversation, which is part of the reason we probably are where we are today. Moving over to Sausan, I want to ask you a question that we talked about some of the questions beforehand. This is not one of them. I want to talk to you about the role of Palestinian citizens of Israel. I remember in the last few years seeing Ayman Odeh, the great Palestinian citizen of Israel, politician, celebrated as sort of the last Democrat, small d, in Israel, the great democratic hope of Israel. And this role that Palestinian citizens of Israel play in positioning themselves as defenders of democracy as Israeli citizens. Can you, looking forward, and Israel is about to go back to elections again, what does that role look like as increasingly there is this recognition that not only is Israeli democracy deeply flawed within the Green Line, but this artificial distinction between sides of the Green Line is no longer sustainable. And that when we talk about rights, it cannot be rights on just one side of the Green Line. What does that look like? What is the role for Palestinian citizens of Israel in that construct?
I don't think that I have, even though this is the allegation, but I don't think that our role was in order to show or not show whether Israel is a democracy or not. I think that the main role was and is to show that the Palestinian citizens of Israel are part of the Palestinian people. 48, 67 Palestinian refugees, and all of them are the Palestinians, and bringing this Palestinian cause to the international community. I think that, and this is as well an issue that we have been doing, not just Adala. I'm not talking only about Adala. I'm talking about all those who are fighting for the Palestinian cause, no matter where they are. Now, it is true that we in Adala and other human rights organizations, we do fight for the fulfillment and protection and respect of equality on all levels, on individual and on a collective level. But the issue is that in our perspective, we like all what we do it with a perception that we are part of the Palestinian people, that looking into any kind of solution, we must be seen and viewed and heard within this conflict, because at some point throughout history and time we were not. And I think as well that the Jewish nation state law helped us a lot in doing that, because our main goal as well is to show that Israel is violating international human rights law, not only international humanitarian law in the occupied territories in the West Bank and Gaza. And the Jewish nation state law, and I'm sorry that I'm all the time getting back to it because it is the most acute and important thing now to talk about in terms of the status of Palestinians in general. 48 again, 67, and refugees, because if we're talking about refugees, this new constitution comes and blocks totally on a constitutional level the return of refugees. It doesn't only impose a constitutional identity on us in 48, and neither only on also 67, and it doesn't only come to enable on a constitutional level to expand settlements and having annexation in an indirect way, but it also blocks the return of Palestinian refugees, and it basically tries to block the solution for the Palestinian conflict, no matter what kind of solution you're talking about. And I'm not talking about one state or two state. I'm keeping myself within the narrative, as I said before, the discourse of human rights, which means self-determination, not just the national self-determination, which is the right to have a nation, but also the practical and other perspective or aspects of self-determination that have been developed in international law, which is the ability to live freely without domination in order to be able to fulfill and have the rights on a political, civil, social, and economic level in the nation, in the borders that you are living in, whether you call it Israel, whether you call it something else.
Thank you. So Nathan, I want to come to you. I want to ask you to talk about backlash, the kind of backlash that comes from using terms like apartheid. And you've written about this before. You've written about the lawfare and the accusations of anti-Semitism against people like Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar. Not for nothing, Rashida Tlaib has used the term apartheid in the past few days when talking about Israel's decision to not do anything, at least affirmatively, do not do anything to help vaccinate Palestinians against COVID, even while it's vaccinating its own citizens living in the West Bank. Can you talk about, first of all, what do you say to people who say that these arguments are anti-Semitic? And that term has been used specifically about the B'Tselem report. I don't know about your article, based on things like the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. That's the first question. And second question is the sort of backlash. What does it say about the space that there is for this analysis to change the narrative, and what it's going to take?
So I'll start with the headline, which is that the IHRA definition is a terrible definition, and it's an absurd one.
I should just interrupt. The IHRA definition is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism. We've done a whole series of webinars on these. There's an enormous amount of resources on our website about that. And it's a definition of anti-Semitism that conflates it largely with criticism of Israel. And back to you, Nathan.
Sure. So the core of the IHRA definition is to say that anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism, and I just want to pull up a few lines from the definition to highlight what's so problematic about it. First of all, it says manifestations might include the targeting of the state of Israel conceived as a Jewish collectivity. And there are three examples, there are several examples given, but three in particular I want to highlight. One is applying double standards by requiring of it, being Israel, a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. And there was an incident 2 years ago now in the largest group Jewish communal organization in the UK, the Board of Deputies. And the vice president of the Board of Deputies, coming back now to what Sausan has been talking about, the vice president criticized the nation state law in an official statement by the Board of Deputies that was very, very mild. I'm trying to see if I have the exact words she used, but it was some of the measures in the law are regressive steps. That was her criticism. And there was a push within the Board of Deputies, a formal motion to boot her out of the Board of Deputies for violating the IHRA definition. She was an anti-Semite for criticizing the nation state law because she applied a double standard to Israel. Where were her statements criticizing Hindu nationalism as the head of the Jewish communal organization of the UK? The definition is already been abused to such a degree that it's truly farcical, and many Israeli government officials are guilty of violating it. And I want to give another example is drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. Now, first of all, not only did the deputy chief of staff of the Israeli army, while he was still deputy chief of staff, do that very thing on Holocaust Remembrance Day in a major speech, but the cabinet minutes of the Israeli government are also anti-Semitic. And I want to just read a small passage from Tom Segev's book, 1949, The First Israelis, on page 26. And he's describing a cabinet meeting in 1948. And the Minister of Agriculture said, "I've received a letter on the subject. I must say," and he's received letters about what Israel is doing during the 1948 war, what Israeli soldiers are doing during the 1948 war. "I've received a letter on the subject. I must say that I have known what things have been like for some time, and I have raised the issue several times already here. However, after reading this letter, I couldn't sleep all night. I felt the things that were going on were hurting my soul, the soul of my family, and all of us here. I could not imagine where we came from and to where we are going. I often disagreed when the term Nazi was applied to the British. I wouldn't like to use the term, even though the British committed Nazi crimes. But now Jews too have behaved like Nazis, and my entire being has been shaken. Obviously, we have to conceal these actions from the public, and I agree that we should not even reveal that we're investigating them, but they must be investigated." If you read Haaretz, Israel's leading newspaper, hardly a month passes where there's not some analogy to the Nazis or some lament about how we as victims have become victimizers. So the IHRA definition is an attempt to outlaw anti-Zionism and to outlaw Palestinian nationalism. Now, to your question about whether using the charge of calling Israel an apartheid state meets the IHRA definition, the answer is yes, because there is a specific part of the definition that rules out any discussion of Israel as racist. Denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination by claiming that for example, by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. And so, yes, apartheid is a system of racial or ethnic domination. It's institutionalized racism. And so, of course, calling Israel an apartheid state or saying that Israel is practicing apartheid clearly meets the IHRA definition, which is very problematic in many, many different ways. Now, to your question about what's actually kind of behind all of this, you know, I think that when we look at, you know, what are the main arguments that are made against the settlement enterprise? The main arguments that are made are, you know, it's immoral to take over the land of the native people and put a different ethnic group on that land which claims a biblical right to it. There's that the land belongs to the existing native inhabitants. The Bible is not a land deed. It's immoral to establish a different ethnic group on top of the land of the native population, which is then excluded from that nation unless they convert. All of these arguments against the settlements apply to Zionism and to Zionist settlement since the Yishuv. And one of the things that has changed is that the early Zionist pioneers and the leaders of the Zionist movement during the Yishuv were unabashed about saying that we have an exclusive right to this land. We have a biblical right to this land. And there was no problem. And there were various kinds of justifications. International socialism will take over, and then there will be brotherhood among all nations. But the bottom line was they had no problem saying that we absolutely have a right to take over this land. It's ours. And their descendants, the Zionist left today, doesn't feel comfortable saying that. They're embarrassed to say such a thing. They find it archaic. And the real threat to the annexationists and the settlement enterprise is not so much you know, European parliamentarians or Israeli human rights organizations or accusations of apartheid. The real threat is the fact that a huge chunk of Israeli society is embarrassed to justify Zionist settlement in the way that Zionist settlement was justified for many decades. And one of the core aspects of the IHRA definition is an attempt to rule out any kind of discussion of the legitimacy of Zionism and to cast it as anti-Semitic and completely out of bounds.
Thank you. And we're almost out of time. I'm going to use the power of the chair to just ask Haggai a bonus question, which relates to something that was after the Q&A blocks. But you know, Israel's about to go back to elections very soon. This has come out. The B'Tselem report got a lot of coverage internationally. It got almost no coverage in Israel in Hebrew. What do you think it's going to take? Do you think there's a chance for a shift in views in Israel? Do you think that you have impact within a report like this? Did you do any sort of study in advance to see how using the word apartheid would in a positive or negative way potentially impact the narrative for Israelis? And that will be the final question.
Yeah, so first, time has moved on, and while the initial coverage was mostly by international media, that is no longer the case. There's been extensive coverage in Israel, in Hebrew in recent days, and we're very pleased about that. And obviously, we also invested a lot of resources, not just you know, being guaranteed of the news coverage, but also on engaging the Israeli public in Hebrew, Jewish Israelis directly. Through social media, through paid advertisements, through having the full report itself in Hebrew as a supplement with Haaretz. So we've done a lot of work in that regard, and I'm pretty pleased of the results so far. And again, as I said before, obviously a lot of work ahead of us. With regard to the coming elections, I think it's an opportunity for us to pause and remind ourselves that that's not going to be a celebration of democracy, quote unquote, as the propaganda line goes, but it's going to be the fourth time in 2 years that people with political rights are going to vote not only on their own future, but also on the future of millions that have no political rights. So that's where we are. And we need to be reminded of that. And again, as long as the international community continues to underwrite this injustice and introduces no consequences, this means that for many of the voters, this isn't broken. There's no reason to fix it because in a self-interest analysis, everything is chiming ahead smoothly. So this issue is not an issue, and voting will happen, as has happened quite a few times in recent years, on other issues and not on this issue. What might give people here a pause and a reason to rethink their political choices if there will be finally consequences. Without that, I see very little hope, and in fact, what we will see is what we're seeing in the statements of who can count already how many years, that the vast majority of political parties in this country agrees on one variation or another of perpetual oppression and apartheid against Palestinians, arguing with themselves about the pace and the details and nothing else. Last thing I want to say, closing remarks, because I'm looking at my clock, and I suspect that some people might have listened to us for the last hour and a half, and they look at their watch, and surprise, it is still 2 minutes to midnight. And I want to ask those people, one, to check on in which time zone they're living, but also to ask themselves on which side of history do they want to be. And finally, to invite them, okay, you've heard it all, and you're still insisting that it's 2 minutes to midnight. Okay, I get it. Please tell me, please, 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 but maybe before that, tell yourself, what will it take to convince you that actually the time is past midnight? How many years, how many settlements, how many settlers, how much injustice, how much bloodshed, how much oppression will it take for you to acknowledge that the time is actually past midnight? And answer that with sincerity, and then we'll have a real conversation.
Thank you. I think that is a great way to end this up. So I'm going to close it here. On behalf of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, I want to thank Sausan, Nathan, and Hagai for participating in today's extremely rich discussion. I wish it could have gone on longer. I want to thank all the people who joined us on Facebook Live and on Zoom, and everyone especially who submitted questions. If your question did not get asked, do not worry. We will be giving them in writing to all of the panelists to inform their thinking and their writing going forward. You'll also be getting a follow-up email if you registered for today's event with a recording of the webinar, so you can share it, and also with links to everything that was in the chat. So, and if you want to learn more about these issues and other issues related to the Israel-Palestine conflict, follow FMEP on Twitter, check out our events on the event page, sign up for our wonderful weekly resources, and we have a webinar coming up on the 29th entitled Redefining Anti-Semitism, Opportunities and Struggles for Progressive Jews. So that's the next one coming up. And with that, I thank you all, and good afternoon to folks in the US. Good evening to all of our colleagues on the ground in the Middle East.
Good evening.